on both ways of approaching the catechism. And certainly can go anywhere we need to go in question and answer at the end.
Okay, apologies if you could do that clap one more time.
Okay. That's to make sure there's no coffee, right? So I guess it's an onus to. I'll do that clap every 40 minutes during this fact. What I propose to do is to speak very briefly about why I'm doing this, what my own involvement in the World Meeting. What is the World Meeting, just to make sure we're all on the same page. I'll do all that in like 5 minutes, and then spend maybe 20 minutes going through the whole catechism quickly, just to sort of hit all the big points, nothing in detail, then we can go back and drill down into anything in Q&A. I am also pleased to say that a very good friend of mine, Ron Belgau, is sitting here in the front row. Ron is staying at the rectory here at OMC for the next 2 weeks because he has 3 or 4 speaking engagements. Ron is a medical ethicist studying and teaching at the University of St. Louis, although right now he's holed up in his family home in Seattle finishing some dissertation work. But Ron is also one of the great writers and speakers today on Catholic, gay, and lesbian issues. And Ron is the speaker at the World Meeting of Families on Catholic, gay, and lesbian issues. And so Ron's going to be here today with us, and he is going to be in the rectory for the next 2 weeks. So he's available for conversation during today's Q&A. I'm going to talk about gay and lesbian stuff, but only for like 2 minutes in the course of the bigger picture. But if we want to come back to it in Q&A, we can. Another thing I was thinking about doing is if there's sufficient interest, next week we could do another one of these sessions specifically focused on that issue because it's so timely and interesting for many people. That's there for now. Okay, so the World Meeting of Families and why am I talking about this? Okay, which first? Well, I'll explain why I'm talking about this first. I actually got interested in the theology of marriage and the family because of some questions I had about gay and lesbian issues. In the late 90s, well, in my 20s and the 90s, I worked in television news in New York and Washington. And in the late 90s, I was assigned as a reporter to cover some of the debates about gay marriage in global Anglicanism. And at the time, the debate in that church was typically between progressive theologians and bishops in this country, Canada, Australia, Western Europe, and more conservative theologians and bishops in those same places, but also the Africans and the South Americans tended to be more traditional. And I spent a lot of time working and reporting on those issues. And I was not a Catholic yet. I was at a stage along the way in my spiritual journey, and I was perplexed by what I was hearing from both the left wing and the right wing. It was a different moment in church history, and for me too. But from the left wing, the arguments typically in favor of same-sex marriage were based on trusting people's experience, trusting people's autonomy and freedom. And how could you be against love, right? It means like being against apple pie. And that kind of rang true for me in some ways. I was working in television in New York and Washington. I had many friends and colleagues for whom that was a persuasive account. But what made me scratch my head was I knew enough about Christianity and enough theology to think, wait a minute, you can't just make an argument in Christianity that leaves out Jesus, that leaves out a sense of vocation, that leaves out the cross and sin. I just felt like that argument was too thin to be fully satisfactory. But meanwhile, from the more conservative side, I was also scratching my head because, again, it felt like, thou shalt not, because of a few verses in Romans and Leviticus. And again, I'm thinking, well, wait a minute, that can't be fully satisfactory either. Somehow, it has to be transparent to good news, to joy, to the glory of God as a human being fully alive. So where's that? You can't, as a friend of Ron and mine, Eve Tushnet says, you can't just have a vocation of no, right? You need to build your life around a vision. So I didn't quite get it. And then when the opportunity came to change gears and do some graduate school work, I chose to work on the theology of marriage and the family because I really wanted to wrestle with that. How do you we heard in today's reading, take up your cross and follow me. My question was, are the disciplines of traditional sexual ethics, as the tradition gives them to us, are those crosses we want to pick up? I know Jesus asks us to do hard things, but we can ask Jesus, why? Where are you taking us? Is this transparent to goodness and beauty and joy too? So that's kind of been my life's work for the last 25 years since then, is to be writing about marriage and the family with this perspective of how do we receive the tradition and embrace its disciplines, but to do so in a way that's radiant with gospel joy. And I think once you get your head wrapped around these issues, for many reasons, I think it has overspill and good fruit in other areas of spiritual and theological life. I think once you wrap your head around the way God's material creation, the world, our bodies, once you get your head around, how that fits with God's plan of redemption and moral theology and sacramental life, then you have a template for viewing economics, the environment. There's no accident that in Laudato Si, Francis' new encyclical, he's saying and appealing to many of the same themes as in this catechism. So I think that it's a good entry point for Christian discipleship, Christian theology in general. So anyway, I've done some writing and some speaking on this topic, and then in late 2013, when the World Meeting of Families was kind of a distant proposition on the horizon, and every time there's a World Meeting of Families, they do this catechism. Whoever the host diocese is does some kind of catechism about marriage and the family, meant to be an offering to the whole universal church, but also with the inflection of whoever the host country is. So that's when the Archdiocese of Philadelphia asked me to be involved in this project. If you've ever seen the catechism, the book, there's no bio in it. This is not a book by Chris Roberts, for very good reason. There were at least 20 or so people involved in the production of this book. I thought my role in it would always be anonymous, and so one day Archbishop Chateau mentioned it at a press conference, and I've been out since then. But really, the way church documents are typically made, they always bring together a team of writers and editors, and multiple drafts are circulated. People take responsibility for writing different ones. These are obviously international projects. There's people in Rome vetting them and reading them. They go through multiple levels of checking. So oftentimes there is a primary writer, a primary editor, but it really is the work of multiple people in multiple countries, multiple institutions, because it's meant to be the voice of the church. It's not some guy in Chestnut Hill. It's meant to be a gift from the church to the church. And excitingly, it's been translated now into all the regular Vatican languages: Italian, French, help me out, Spanish, Portuguese, German, and also it's in Polish, Slovak, Vietnamese, and more all the time. So anyway, the World Meeting of Families. Just to talk quickly about what that is. How's this work? Why is this not going from thing to thing? Oh, am I doing? Well, Ron, if you can figure out how to click it. Okay, click. Okay. Which one was that?
Try that one.
That one? Okay. So it's coming up in about 2 weeks. It was founded by John Paul II in 1994. They had the first one in Rome. They've had it every 3 years since then in all those places. It's interesting. We're the first one that's not an Italian, Spanish, or Portuguese speaking place. That's kind of interesting. It's kind of had a definite Latin inflection so far. And it's analogous roughly to World Youth Day. So you saw 2 million people on the beach with Francis in Rio a year or two ago. Happens in non-World Youth Day years. Sponsored by the Pontifical Council for the Family, and what will happen, so there's elements of prayer and worship, there's elements of teaching and workshops, and there's entertainment and parties too. It's broken down and it's organized into 3 different events. Most of the discussion has been about the papal events on the Parkway, but so on the Tuesday to Friday of the week, there's an adult congress at the convention center. Workshops, speaking, perpetual adoration opportunities. There's mass every day down there. Confession. 17,000 people are coming to that so far. which is the biggest World Meeting of Families they've ever had. There were 7,000 at Milan 3 years ago. Some really, really interesting, exciting presentations. The Catechism is the structure for the Congress. So over those course, each workshop kind of ties to some section of the Catechism they work through. Ron, as I mentioned, is the speaker on gay and lesbian issues on Thursday afternoon. You still have one more day. I think tomorrow is the last day for registering online to attend the Congress. You do need a ticket. It's in the convention center. I think if you go to worldmeeting2015.org, there's details for how to do that. And you can, and most of the registration options are pitched to people from out of town, and they will look intimidatingly expensive. But if you poke around, there is a slightly cheaper day pass for Philadelphians who just want to drop in for a day or something. And then there's also at the same time a youth congress. I've been taking my 7 and 10-year-old daughters. It's analogous to the adult congress in the sense that there's instruction, there's entertainment, there's worship. Again, all this connected to the Catechism in one way or another. But I think it's going to be really fun. You drop your child off and they're fine. They're taken care of. They're in the zone for the day. And I know there's like a bowling with the bishops game. There's a swinging with the sisters kind of a dance competition or something. And there's basketball with the seminarians. I don't think they're all like alliteration with somebody, but I think that there's a lot of sort of fun, creative activities that they've got to mix it up for the kids. And then, of course, the papal events on the Parkway, which I don't propose to talk about a lot right now. We can talk about it in Q&A if anybody has any questions, but I'm completely out of the loop about tickets and practicalities and how many porta potties there will be, but we can talk about that if necessary in Q&A. Okay, so there's the Catechism. I already talked about how it came to be. Why does it matter? Why is this book important? Well, 3 practical reasons. I mean, it explains why we're having the World Meeting of Families. It explains why he's coming. I mean, this is the structure and the agenda for the Congress. But most importantly, our vision for the booklet is to tell a coherent story about Catholic theology in general and about marriage and family in particular. How do you connect the dots from basic stuff like Jesus loves me? This I know, before the Bible tells me so. Jesus loves me. We've met Jesus. He's introduced us to who God is. God has met us in and through this church that we have. How do you work from, we participate in the church and the sacraments. How do you connect the dots from this basic stuff to, the more granular questions of our daily life and discerning our vocations? To tell that story in a way that has lasting impact and that is accessible to people. So it begins, the outline of the Catechism, it begins talking about creation, the way that God reaches out to us and makes a covenant with us. What is a human being? What does it mean to be created in the image of God? Then finally in chapter 4, we actually get to marriage and family and children. Chapter 6 talks about celibacy because all love bears fruit. Everybody created in the image of God has this mission of love. And that we'll talk more about that in a minute. 7 and 8 are where we get into some of the more controversial issues and some of the obstacles to living the vision. And then we come back out in chapter 9 and 10, talk about the church, talk about how family and sexuality connects with some of the other issues. So chapter 1, Created for Joy. Each chapter has a really beautiful painting associated with it from different collections around the world. Back in the spring when we did a reading group here in the parish, we focused on the words. I sort of tempted to propose another reading group where we just talk about the paintings, and you could just engage with the paintings. That would be interesting. So everything in Christianity flows from Jesus, right? We don't just have random disembodied values for no reason. It all comes to and flows from Jesus. We don't read Scripture with isolated proof text. Scripture's not like a dictionary or a phone book where you look up a particular verse and say, oh, okay, there's a flow to it, there's an arc to it, everything has a context and a reason for being there. And it begins with Jesus. He's obviously the center of our faith. Christians are people who encounter Jesus, right? We encounter Jesus in the Word, in the sacraments, in and through each other, our families and friends and community. We encounter Jesus We learn to trust Jesus. And to make a long story short, which we can go back to if we need to, we learn from Jesus that God, in God's inner essence, is an eternal triune community of love. God is a communion in his essence. And that's why when we say that we're created in the image of God, we're making a claim about God is a communion of three persons. We are made in the image of a communitarian God, a God who orients us. Our origin and therefore our destiny is communion. We're made creatures because God wants to have communion with us, and he makes us, he creates us so that we can have communion with one another. So everything flows from that Trinitarian font, which already you can see is going to pay off huge dividends down the line when we talk about moral theology, community, church, because Christianity is a great assault on loneliness. Right? No one should be alone in Christianity. I'm just looking at John Rogan, and I'm reminded of the summer session that we had, an encounter with Pope Francis, where we talked about immigration, racism, the problems with prison incarceration, unemployment, and we will see that in this next bit here. Yeah, Pope Francis says. There's not going to be a lot of text in these PowerPoint slides, but here's one. There's going to be two that I really want to linger on. Paragraphs. This is in the Catechism. Again and again, the Church has acted as a mediator in finding solutions to problems affecting peace, social harmony, the land, defense of life, human and civil rights, and so forth. And how much good has been done by Catholic schools and universities around the world. This is a good thing. Yet we find it difficult to make people see that when we raise other questions, and he means in context, he means abortion, he means same-sex marriage, he means contraception. When we raise other questions less palatable to public opinion, we are doing so out of fidelity to precisely the same convictions about human dignity and the common good. So we are made in the image of a triune God. We are created for a communion with one another. And everything we're doing in Catholic social teaching about the poor, or in Catholic personal theology about family and sexuality is flowing from that same impetus to create bonds of community. And that's why when you get your head figured out about one area of moral theology, it should translate into others. In the Catechism, every chapter has, at the end of it, it's short, each chapter is 3 or 4 pages. Each chapter has these kinds of questions for discussion. And I'll share them with you for the first 3 chapters. I don't propose that we go into them in detail right now. If this is what we did in the book group in the spring when we had a read-through, I'd be delighted to do another book group, another read-through in the fall if there's interest in it. But you can see from these questions the kinds of themes that we're getting at in the catechisms, the kinds of discussion we're hoping to evoke. What is it about Jesus that makes him trustworthy? That raises questions of who do you say that I am? It also raises questions about our own life. What's going on in our own journey that might make us defensive or resistant to trusting Jesus? What things in your life distract you? What would help you become more familiar or intimate with Jesus? What does it mean to be created in the image of God? Is it possible to understand human identity without God? That's a lot of times, if I'm teaching in a college class and we're talking about the image of God, what is a human person? You say to someone, on the street, what is it that makes human beings special? What is it that makes us unique? And typically people start to speculate. Well, we're rational. We can think, or we've got rational brains or something like that. And that's Descartes. That's Kant. That's 18th century French and German philosophy. Classical Christianity says, what is it that makes human beings special? It's not our brains. It's being created for communion. And that's why, just little sidebar, you can see how, if you think what makes a human being have dignity, if you root human dignity in rational thought, in the ability to be an autonomous mental thinker and chooser, you are going to have problems when you get to medical ethics at the beginning and end of life. You're going to have. That's why is that creature in the womb, does it have human dignity? Do the sick people who are dependent, do they have human dignity? We Catholics have an answer because we know that we're created to give and receive love, right? But I think people, it really matters where you root human dignity, why you're created in the image of God. So love is our mission. Anyway, you get the idea. These questions are designed to evoke a certain type of discussion. The mission of love. But the Bible, the Bible bursts with so many different images of God's love. God is a father welcoming his prodigal son. God is a shepherd searching for his lost sheep. God is a mother comforting her children. God is a friend who lays down his life for others. God is a teacher. God is a gardener tending us until we bear good fruit. Each one of these I'm reading has a scriptural reference. God is a king inviting us to a wedding banquet. God hears the blind man's cry and stops to welcome him, etc., etc. There are so many images and metaphors to describe how God loves us and wants us to love him back. But, arguably, the two architectonic images that occur most frequently in Scripture for God's love are friendship, talk more about that later, and marriage. In all the Old Testament prophets, Yahweh marries Israel. Yahweh woos and courts Israel. When things go wrong, when Israel falters, worships other gods, it's described with vivid images of adultery and betrayal. And the Song of Songs, for roughly over 1,000 years, from roughly, let's say, the 2nd century to the 12th century, the Song of Songs was more popular for homilies than any other book of the Bible. There are more homilies written in medieval and apostolic patristic times about the Song of Songs than any other book of the Bible. And they took the song as an allegory of God's erotic love for us, God's desiring love for us. So when God forms a covenant with Israel, and he makes his promises to remain faithful to Israel, no matter how much you sin, Israel, I will always love you. And in the Song of Songs, Israel, I desire you deeply, like a bridegroom desiring the bride. Those two images of God's fidelity in the covenant and God's desire for us in the song, they come together to make marriage one of the great images for God's love and God's relationship with his people, which comes to a climax in the New Testament, not only in the Revelation images of heaven as a wedding banquet, but especially in Ephesians 5, where Paul, we get the idea of marriage as a sacrament, because Paul says, Christ loves the church like a bridegroom loving a bride, and so much flows from that. The idea of marriage as, again, depends what you think a human being is, where you root your vision of a human. But in Christianity, we want to say marriage is romantic, it is erotic, but it's governed by God's fidelity, God's covenant with us. How does God love us? He loves us erotically, but he also ultimately loves us sacrificially in the shape of the cross. And so marriage as a sacrament, it reveals God's love to us because it's an invitation to be in a covenant like God's covenant with the church, God's covenant with Israel, to love God, to love the spouse in a sacrificial way. In our scripture, to save your life, you have to lose it. That's very much enacted in the asceticism of marriage, where to save a marriage and to keep a marriage growing and flourishing, you regularly make sacrifices. You offer yourself up. And so, marriage in some ways is a sacrament because it's recapitulating that sacrificial inner motion of heart, where we're yielding up ourselves and our prerogatives for the sake of love. And again, these same, but you can see these questions again designed to evoke certain themes. When you're working with marriage as a sacramental, cross-shaped, sacrificial way of loving, you're obviously going to be in some tension with a more secular notion of marriage as a contract between two individuals for romantic satisfaction, right? So the rationale for many divorces, our needs were no longer being met or something. You can see there's different visions of love out there, and we can go more into that in Q&A. But again, this idea that we have a picture of love that is committed and sacrificial and based on the scriptural pattern, and that will take us into different places. I need to speed up to catch up on time, so I'll start skimming a little bit more. But what's going on as we move into more specifically marriage and family-related things is, Catholicism is a robustly physical religion, right? The sacramental life. When we feed the hungry, give drink to the thirsty, clothe the naked. When we trust in the goodness of God's creation. Think of Catholic art and architecture. Think of our liturgical calendar's rhythm of feasting and fasting. The physical, tangible, created world is always part and parcel of Catholic life. And so it's with that perspective that we start to talk about our maleness and our femaleness. How do we bring our bodies, our maleness and femaleness, into this Catholic way, where we're confident and insistent that God speaks to us in through the material creation. That the material creation can be transparent, can be the very stuff of God's presence, and our sexuality, our maleness and our femaleness is no different. Our personally significant features become part of God's plan of redemption. And so marriage emerges. Okay, we're mammals. How do mammals mate? How do we do what mammals do in a Christological, cruciform way? Right? So you can be an anthropologist and you can study silverback gorillas. And you can watch the way the silverback gorilla pounds on his chest and dominates the what do you call it, the pride, the pack. And you can look at nature, and there are other models for mating out there. There are many ways to raise children. How can we do it in a way that reflects our Catholic confidence in the goodness of creation? How can we do it in a way that witnesses to Jesus and the way of the cross? So Jesus, I got to take a little sidebar. So you can see now why it starts to emerge here, some of the actual concrete ethical things. Why are we against casual sex? Why are we against conditional episodic sexual relations? It's because we believe that love isn't looking for an exit clause, right? Love is not an audition. God doesn't say to Israel, hey, I like you better than the Philistines, but if you screw up, I'm out of here. Yahweh doesn't say, if I get a job offer in California, or I need to go to graduate school, I'm done with you, Israel. God doesn't say to Israel, well, as long as we're scratching each other's backs, we can be, God's love is not an audition. And that's why Catholic intimacy is situated in the covenant, because we're working with that same pattern. Again, so we're moving into more specific moral stuff, but we're keeping it tied to the basics. This is an interesting thing. Things like rest, food, pleasure, beauty are attractive, but sometimes we have deeply felt desires and appetites beyond what are good for us, right? So if you understand why, if you've ever had the experience of telling a child, no, you can't have chocolate ice cream for breakfast, it's not good for you. It's not going to help you flourish. You begin to understand why, when the church says no to something, it's always for the sake of a deeper yes, to enable something more profound. Okay. Pope Francis, we gave last year when we knew Pope Francis was coming at school, we gave out little refrigerator magnets. I don't know if everyone has seen them, but Pope Francis says, marriage is an art that depends on 3 words. Please, thank you, I guess it's 1 word in Spanish, and sorry. Please, thank you, and sorry. And so, when we have marriage, when we're trying to bring the fertility of the 2 sexes into a practice of mercy and self-commitment, and commitment, what does that look like? That's when, the concept of chastity starts to emerge. How do you talk about your sexuality in ways that are transparent, resisting the disposable society, right? People are not disposable. So when we treat sexuality where we're reverent to other people, not using them as just fodder to our appetite, that's when we start to use words like chastity. I think it was last summer in Brazil, Pope Francis talking to young people, he used the phrase, go against the flow. By chastity, he means, look, everything in our culture is pushing us towards treating sexuality as a commodity. Sex sells is a phrase, right? You can't even watch a football game without getting involved in the commodification of sexuality with the commercials. And Francis is speaking about this, linking his critique of capitalism to his advocacy of chastity. So If marriage takes biology into the covenant, that obviously raises the possibility of children. And so it's in chapter 5 where we start to talk about the family and children. And if we've tried to do coupling in a Christological way, how do we do family life in a way that's transparent to Jesus and God's work? Love is our mission, in a phrase. And so the purpose of parenting is to bring our children into this mission of love. The Vatican II phrase, one of the Vatican II documents, Gaudium et Spes, reclaimed a phrase that was even older, goes back to patristic times, the domestic church. And what we really need to do to reclaim the legacy of Vatican II is reclaim this language of domestic church, where the family is conceptualized as a little cell, as a little piece of the body, oriented to the parish church, serving the parish church. And becoming a domestic church means orienting family life to participation in the whole people of God. Interestingly, in the paragraphs of Vatican II where it talks about domestic church, it says the purpose of, I'm paraphrasing a little bit, but it's basically saying the purpose of parenting is to help children discover their vocation. The purpose of parenting is to raise children who are attentive and listening to God's word, God's call upon their life. It's in the Catechism, paragraph, I think 77, it quotes it, paragraphs. But that's meant to orient family life. What kind of media are we consuming in our household? What kind of witness am I making to my children? It's again, we're not just trying to get the kids into Harvard. It's really a countercultural way of life with some teeth to it, if you reflect on it for a minute. Celibacy. The domestic church has the orientation it does to love and serve because it's created of people who are, the domestic church is composed of people who are created to love and serve. Well, celibate people, everybody's made in the image of God. Everybody has love as their mission. Celibacy is also made for love, service, and communion. This means that in Catholic thought, celibacy is not a synonym for loneliness. Right? I like to say that in the way that Eskimos have 20 words for snow, because they're around snow all the time, and they see, an Eskimo can see different distinctions between different types of wet and dry snow, and so they've got all these subcategories. In the Christian tradition, there are 20 different words for celibacy. And, friar, monk, nun, sister, brother, widow, consecrated virgin, with the possible exception of hermit, and even there it's arguable, or stylite. All the different words for celibate, consecrated life imply community. They imply belonging to an extended household. So, when Augustine would counsel single people to be chaste in the 4th century, he imagined the unmarried would be part of an extended household. And really, there's a great tradition of writing in the medieval period on spiritual friendship. And I think one of the differences between our contemporary culture and medieval apostolic patristic culture is that they had many more categories for friendship than we have. In our culture, we tend to collapse intimacy into marriage. Right? We tend to think that if you're not married, you're somehow going to be alone. Ron said at a meeting we were in on Friday, he thinks this is part of the vocations crisis in the church today, is that people think, if my son or daughter doesn't get married, what will become of them? But I think, again, part of reclaiming our tradition is to start to conceptualize less about the nuclear family and more about the extended family, more about the parish as an extended family. St. Paul talks about in Galatians, when he's outlining what a church should be, he has a picture of bearing each other's burdens. And we'll see how that makes a difference. But the key to thinking is, if you're going to be, celibacy means being at the service of others. How can you serve the church? It also means how can the church serve you? So, there needs to be an ebb and a flow. And that's described in detail in the Catechism between family life and parish life that includes a rich vision of adopted uncles and aunts. And I will get back to that in a minute. Okay. In one of his homilies last week, Pope Francis said, the difference in this particular passage in the New Testament, the difference between the demons and Peter, and this wasn't the same passage we had today, when Jesus says, who do you say that I am, is that the demons and Peter, they both recognize Jesus as the Christ. But the demons are so proud, and that's all they're going to do. Yeah, you're Jesus, but I'm not going to bow to you. You have no authority over me. Peter falls down on his knees and says, have mercy on me, Lord, the sinner. So the demons are people. Everyone can recognize Jesus. Not everyone can own their sin. And so in chapter 7, it starts to talk about obstacles to living this vision. And it can be practical obstacles like poverty and loneliness. And it can also be interior issues. This is the chapter where we talk about pornography. And why is the church against pornography? It's not only because so many of the people pictured in pornography are being commodified and put in situations of abuse. It's also because those who use pornography is essentially a catechesis in selfishness, a catechesis in entitlement, in which other people are put on display for your appetite. If any of the the classic sexual sins, you would want to frame in that way. What are they doing to your interior life? What is we could talk in Q&A about the difference between contraception and natural family planning and the effect that has on the interior life. Pope Francis calls the church a field hospital. And it's because Jesus teaches many things about sex and marriage that are difficult to accept. But we struggle with it. And so how do we, with patience and the sacraments, how do we grow in virtue? And a sense of humor, actually, because we're all going to stumble and look ridiculous. How do we support one another in this journey? Pope Benedict, this chapter uses a phrase from Pope Benedict. He calls a parish a family of families. And that, and the idea is that it takes Christian community to enable us to live the virtues. A really quick story to illustrate what I mean. It's not in the Catechism, but is very much what I have in mind when I read these paragraphs. This is a true story. A friend of mine, a colleague of mine, tells this story. Tom and Sue were an alcoholic. They were married. Sue was an alcoholic. Sue's alcoholism was ruining the family. After 10 years, Tom was like, I can't take this anymore. I can't do this. And he goes to his pastor and he says, I'm going to get a divorce. And the pastor says, of course, I understand. We will accompany you. We've got compassion. I understand why nobody could be married to Sue. It would be too much to take. Later that same day, the pastor runs into the leader of a Bible study that Tom and Sue are part of. And I have to pause right there and just note, Tom and Sue are part of the Bible study. So they have a pre-existing small Christian community where there's a big bank account of trust, a lot of years of prayer and scripture study that they are going to draw upon. These things don't just happen spontaneously. Anyway, the pastor says to the Bible study leader, hey, I ran into Tom today, told him he's going to divorce Sue, told him that we'd walk with him and support him and understand him. And the Bible study leader kind of pauses for a second and says, wait a minute, are you crazy? We can't just stand by and let this happen. We're Christians. We owe them more than that. And so the Bible study leader says, just let me just talk to Tom. Let's try this. Let's make sure that every single day somebody phones and picks up Sue and gets her to an AA meeting. Let's make sure that every single day somebody takes Tom out for breakfast or lunch. Let's stock that freezer with casseroles to make their evenings less stressful. Let's make sure that every weekend we give them babysitting so Tom and Sue can have some time to talk. Essentially, the plan was, and this is what happened in truth, they surrounded that family with so much love and support and accountability that they saved that marriage. In other words, if that family had been conceived as a private, autonomous thing, where that marriage happened behind the white picket fence and the closed door and the pulled shutters, if that was a self-sufficient family, that divorce would have happened. And things like that happen to all of us. All of us are in imperfect situations. But the point of the story is to say that in a supportive Christian community, in a parish situation where people had the vision, of being created for love and accountability and support, they were able to do things a little differently. And they saved a marriage. So that, the story is, who of us can do, Jesus asks us to do tough things. Who of us is strong enough to do it on their own? Nobody, right? We all need grace, patience, the sacraments, and friends. And this is just a quote from the Catechism. For a parish to actually be a family of families calls for concrete actions of hospitality and generosity. To give and receive help are intimate things. I'm just skipping some sentences. There is no substitute for ordinary parishioners simply befriending and serving one another during the week. How lay people treat each other will determine whether a parish is fulfilling its mission. This vision of parish life can be taught and modeled by clergy, and I think that's important. I think in large parishes where there's a temptation and a vulnerability to anonymity, where it's very easy to be in the back of the church and just slip out and not get noticed, I think it does take some initiative and leadership. But in the end, to make a parish alive in this way can't be clericalized. This is one of those roads to practical holiness that doesn't matter what the bishops are doing, doesn't matter what the priests are doing. Bearing each other's burdens in this way is up to us. And it's linked to Imago Dei. It's straight from creation. It's saying we're created for creation, we're created for communion, we're created for covenant, and this is what it means to live it out. And then in the final chapters, it rounds up with some discussion of the church as the bride of Christ, a she, not an it. Getting back to this metaphor of the marital metaphor. This is an important chapter for getting your, maybe if you have theological, spiritual questions about the abuse crisis. How is it that the church maintains its sanctity and its authority even when the leaders seem worse than out to lunch sometimes? And then finally in chapter 10, there's some allusions, some opening out to how, if we've got this idea that Jesus is trustworthy, that God has made us in his image, that we're called to do certain covenantal practices with each other, if we've accepted that marriage is cruciform, if we've accepted that children are to be welcomed into the domestic church, how does that orient us to other issues, like economics or like ecology? How does that orient us? Sometimes we're going to find ourselves at odds with the broader culture. How do we live as minorities, faithful minorities, in a culture where the reception of our values by other people is a mixed bag? Anywhere along the way, we could drill down and talk for hours. But this has already gone on longer than I expected. I apologize. I'm happy to stay for Q&A, until the next group comes down. But why don't we give it 15 minutes and just see what people are thinking? And I remind you of Ron here as a resource, and Ron's offer to talk next week too.
I'm going to turn off. Your